All right. Well, thank you all for being here. My name is Sarah Otai. I'm the Executive Director of Harrington Coastal Science Center. And we're here for is this our final cabin fever for the season? Yeah. We're all feeling less cabin fevery, so we might do a couple of spring fever programs. One of the next things we're going to do on April 2nd is we're going to have a felting program where we can make really beautiful, cool nudibranchs and other things out of felted wool. We'll also be doing hopefully an alewife trip in April and at least one more coastal meetup. As far as announcements, I would like to let you know there are exits all the way around, so just if you need to run, you can go almost any direction. Make sure your cell phones are silenced. Thank you all so much for being here. I got 2 or 3 more things to bring up. Look on our webpage for links to the past presentations. We have YouTube videos of the last 2 presentations on plastics and coastal resilience and green crabs, all on our website. So if you go to our website and you miss one of these, you can pretend you were here and watch it just like you're in the audience. We have a ton of people in the audience and more jumping in. So, and don't forget to sign up for our camps. We already have all of our camps open up, all of our aqua tots or ocean hours. So look on our website for anything there. We have our auction coming up, I think on April 13th through 27th. So please come to our website. There's amazing things that are going to be auctioned, silent auctioned off. You only have 2 weeks to bid. There's a lot of cool experiences, one-of-a-kind art, some really nice things to check out. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our educator, Katie Liberman, who's going to introduce our speaker, who's coming to us all the way from Florida, I expect. Okay, thank you very much, Katie.
For the introduction, Sarah, and thank you all for coming tonight here in person and virtually. We have people coming from all over Maine and all over the world apparently tonight, so thank you all for coming. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce my good friend, Dr. Lauren Rice. Lauren and I go way back. We were dive buddies at the University of Maine, so we did the scientific diving together. We had a lot of cool adventures, but I won't go into that. Dr. Lauren Rice comes to us with a background in marine sciences from her undergraduate studies and a PhD in biology from the University of Oregon. She's currently studying a postdoctoral fellowship at the Florida State University. And so I'll talk a little bit about research. So her research centers on the reproductive ecology of invertebrate species, looking at community ecology, organismal interactions, and symbioses. She's worked on systems in nearshore environments to the deep sea. And so there's a lot of different factors that can influence the reproductive capabilities of a species. And reducing these factors often requires careful consideration of the local environment as well as the community the organism exists in. So she uses an integrative approach, using a lot of different techniques to study these, including morphological and genetic identification, microscopy, stable isotope analysis, microbiome analysis, and larval culturing techniques to look at when and how successfully a species reproduces in the context of its community and environment. So during her undergrad, she looked at mudflats, oyster aquaculture farms, and oyster pest species. After graduation, she researched on cold water coral reproduction. And in grad school, she collaborated in research on multiple invertebrate species from the continental shelf and slope habitats, as well as chemosynthetic systems. At the same time, she conducted a dissertation focusing on epibiotic barnacles and polypletes. So she's done a lot of cool stuff. So you join me in welcoming Dr. Lauren Rice.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Katie, for that wonderful introduction, as well as to Herringut for organizing this wonderful opportunity and this event tonight. And to all of you people on Zoom and in person in the audience, thank you all so much for coming out to listen to this little webinar as I discuss deep sea science. So as Katie had mentioned in my intro, my path through science and what I have worked on in my career so far has been very broad, focusing on both oysters, which you can see here on this slide, as well as deep sea research. And kind of double dipping in both worlds, both shallow and deep ocean work is actually very common for a lot of deep sea researchers. And that's primarily because getting consistent access to deep sea samples as well as ship time can be very intermittent. So we try to stay flexible in what type of questions we can answer and address. But I was very fortunate that during the course of my PhD, I was able to spend, cumulatively speaking, about 7 months working out on the high seas, specifically on deep water environments. And you can see this image here, which was taken far out in the South Pacific, actually. So my talk today, unfortunately, won't be able to touch on every single aspect of the deep sea in terms of biology, just because there is so much to cover. But I will briefly go over what the deep sea actually is, how we're able to actually physically study it, and I will be discussing some of my personal favorite environments that can be found in the deep ocean. So without further ado, just to try and get everyone a little oriented as to where we're going to be focusing on for the talk today, the oceans cover about 70% of the Earth's surface, and the general rule of thumb is that the deep sea begins at and below 200 meters or around 660 feet. And that point, that threshold, is generally considered the deepest point that sunlight can reach in any significant margin. Below that point in the open ocean, in the middle of nowhere, far away from the continents, that's usually where photosynthesis tends to stop. Below that, light fades really quickly and you get into what we call the twilight zone. And most of the ocean, in terms of volume, and most of the sea floor, in terms of surface area, actually fall into the category of the deep sea. And therefore, this actually occupies most of the habitable living space on the planet, falls into the deep sea. And so as such, as you can imagine, this portion of the world has an incredible amount of diversity, both in terms of life and in terms of physical geologic areas that can actually exist on the seafloor. So just to try and help put this into perspective, think of the United States and think of all the different habitats and environments that can be found just within our own country. Everything from deserts to mountains, rainforests, everything in between, all exists in a particularly, a relatively small surface or a small portion of our planet. And so the deep ocean, if you really extend that out, also contains a huge amount of diversity. So you can find everything from volcanic chains, vast mountain ranges, vast plains and deserts, rolling hills, deep trenches, tall cliffs, everything that you can imagine you can find out there. And so studies focusing primarily on the deep sea began in earnest in the 1870s with the multiple year expedition of the HMS Challenger. And this expedition kind of went all over the world, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, and kind of was the very first focused attempt to try and look at what actually is in the deep sea. And in the 150 years since the expedition, we have actually there's been a lot of concerted effort, and we have learned a lot about the deep ocean, what lives there, how it impacts the surrounding planet, and how it actually functions. But I just want to have Katie help poll the room here. What do you guys think of when someone mentions the deep sea, and what type of feelings does it inspire?
Obviously, it's dark.
Yes, it is very dark.
And some of the fishes.
The fishes are indeed very weird, yes.
Oh.
And
Cold. Someone
yep,
said
very, very cold,
Someone else said mysterious.
mysterious.
Geothermal vents.
Geothermal vents, that's a good one.
Trenches, deep trenches. Sarah said trenches.
Okay.
Pressures.
Oh.
Pretty high pressure is being set.
Yeah, yeah. These are all very on the nose and actually really informative too. Anything on the chat?
Creatures, smiley face, wide open spaces.
Yes. Yeah, so really good answers, really pretty much on the nose here. So I was also really curious at what the general perception of the deep sea is. It's something I've always been really curious about because obviously I'm a little biased. And so I just on Monday Googled what is the deep sea, and I was able to get this nice AI overview if my computer gets unfrozen. There we go. And this is what the AI algorithm spat out. And it, as you guys mentioned, it is, well, as I mentioned, it starts below 200 meters, so that's 660 feet. It states twice that it's underexplored. And then it goes through and lists some of the physical attributes that you guys also read back to me. So extreme pressures, it's cold, it's dark. And then it throws out a lot of really fun jargony terms like biodiversity and bioluminescence. And I just wanted to take the moment to point out that some of these phrases maybe don't inspire the most excitement or positive feelings. You know, usually when people say that they're cold and dark and they're under a lot of pressure, it's not exactly a happy feeling. And it's really interesting because a lot of these phrases that physically describe the deep sea, unfortunately can translate into how we oftentimes perceive these type of environments and the animals that live there. So also on Monday, I decided to just do a quick hit to see what the top video searches were. And I found these three titles that were like focusing on the strange and unusual creatures and the unspeakable horrors of the deep sea and why it frightens us. And I think these do a really good job kind of summarizing almost the thalassophobia that really, or the fear of the deep water that almost permeates the culture and in some ways can influence how we view the deep sea and whether or not it should be protected and how it should be protected. Because these type of titles and approaches can almost leave us with the feeling that we're discussing something other, you know, something almost alien, even though we're actually discussing the biggest part of our own planet. And these are creatures that are also denizens of our own world. And so I guess as we move forward through the rest of this talk, just try to remember that these are actually really interesting creatures and they also deserve our love and appreciation, and they're actually really cool. And actually, a recent TikTok went viral because it showed an anglerfish swimming up near the surface waters on the Tenerife Sea, just off the Canary Islands. And as a quick aside, I just want to state that a lot of times when you see pictures of these strange little fish, they actually are much smaller than you think. There's actually right here, you can see the photo of the actual fish next to a person. They're actually really small. But a lot of times when we're seeing these pictures, you know, they're really blown up and really in good detail, but the fish is swimming in a blue void, so there's no real sense of scale. But this video did a really good job at reminding us that the deep sea is never really that far away, and it oftentimes is a lot closer than we might think it is. And so, in fact, the deep ocean is very important to several different aspects of our day-to-day lives that we might not often think about. For example, it can influence the various food that we like to eat. For example, orange roughy is a deep water fish that is a very popular food fish. It can also influence the air that we breathe based on some recent findings. And probably the most common, it can do a really good job influencing and inspiring the entertainment media that we oftentimes engage with. And so one of the very common questions I'm always asked is how we actually study the deep sea. And to kind of break this down, the very first thing that's important for deep sea science is unfortunately funding. I'm not really going to focus on this very much, except to say that it can take many years to actually get a grant to fund a deep sea research and an expedition. So just be aware, unfortunately, it takes a lot of time and effort here. But the next step is once you get your successful funding, you need to assemble the team. These are going to be the people that make up the science party that oftentimes you're going to be collaborating with and then physically going out to sea with. These are going to be the boots on the ground, for example, that will be going out, conducting the work that needs to be done at sea to help you actually gather your samples, run and maintain the equipment, run the experiments, gather and make sure the data is not coming back an absolute mess, et cetera, et cetera. And because the deep sea, getting funding can be very intermittent, and the dirty little secret about deep sea is that it's very expensive to do research in it. And so what this means is that deep sea biology and deep sea research in general is actually very collaborative, almost to an aggressive sense. And this is primarily because if you actually have funding to go out to sea and to fund an expedition, you want to try and maximize as much as what you're going to get out of that expedition as you physically can. So oftentimes what happens is when a researcher finds out that they have a grant, they're going out to sea, it's almost like an open call. They reach out to a lot of their friends and collaborators and people who work in similar fields, and they ask, what samples do you potentially need? Do you need any video? Do you need help with anything? Or if you have any, if I have an extra berth, I will oftentimes put out an open call to see who can come out and help fill that space. And so just as an example of this photo right here is of a science team that I was part of back in 2022, where we went out to the South Pacific for 2 months. And we were working on hydrothermal vent communities, which I will be discussing later. And so just to try and summarize who was actually participating in this, including those who are zooming in from shore, we had representatives from 7 different universities from 4 different countries. And including those that were involved just out at sea, we had both tenured and untenured professors, postdoctoral research scholars, graduate students, including both masters and PhDs, lab technicians, as well as undergraduate volunteers and interns. And this is a typical makeup. We have people from all across the career field and the career path coming out to help out with these. The very next thing that you need is a ship. You actually need to get out to the deep sea, far enough offshore so you can actually get access to that deep water. And it kind of acts as that home base that you can live and work on for a good long while. So I personally have been on vessels that have been maintained through the University National Oceanographic Laboratory System, or UNOLS. And this fleet is jointly owned by the National Science Foundation, the Office of Naval Research, as well as various US universities. The fleet has a total of 18 research vessels, including 5 that are designated as global class. And these global class vessels are what I primarily have experience with. And as an example, for that research cruise out to the South Pacific to work on hydrothermal vents in 2022, we were based on this ship here, the Thomas G. Thompson. The Thompson is 274 feet long and about 50 feet across. And the ship can accommodate 36 scientists and engineers in addition to the full ship's crew. And it can actually be at sea for upwards of 70 days, and it can traverse 16,000 nautical miles before it needs to head back to port to be refueled. So these are incredible vessels that can go out, and they can also withstand some pretty nasty seas as well. And as you can imagine, these vessels are also fully equipped with everything that you might need to live and work in the middle of nowhere for 2 months. So they actually include spaces such as a gym, a movie lounge, libraries, laundry facilities, in addition to the living and lab spaces. So for example, the galley where you eat, you can see it up in this upper right hand photo here. The photo was taken on Halloween, by the way. The galley is open 24 hours a day. There is always snacks available and always coffee ready and hot, ready and freshly made. And that's primarily because there's always someone up and awake working at all hours of the day. You oftentimes have engineers and ship's crew who are on watch, making sure nothing is going wrong with the ship. Or you also have the odd scientist who's up late trying to catch up on sample processing before the next round comes in. There are also 3 square meals that are served each day, and I do have a picture of sushi here on this photo and on the slide, primarily because to try and highlight that the meals that they serve on these research expeditions actually tend to be really tasty, and a lot of that is primarily just to try and keep morale high. Work days tend to be very long. There have been instances where I've had repeated like 20+ hour work days for almost a week at a time. And looking forward to that nice, delicious meal definitely goes a long way to help keep morale high. I also have here a picture of a berth or the bedroom where you're assigned to during your stay. And you almost always have a bunkmate unless you either have a really small science party or unless you're really lucky. And you also share a headspace or a bathroom with another room. And as you can see, there's a lot of hard angles and a lot of metal. It's not exactly the most cozy space, but primarily you're only in here to sleep. And you can see each bed has these blue blackout curtains. And that's primarily so if you're trying to get some rest, but your bunkmate has to get up at like 2 a.m. to go to work, you can at least stay in the dark and stay asleep and get some rest while they're getting up and doing their thing. The very next thing that you need and what we always have to work with out at sea is the actual equipment. This is what we use to actually interact with the deep sea in either the water column or that space or the water above the seafloor or the actual seafloor itself. And these can include basic pieces of equipment like moorings or landers, which you can see here in this rightmost image. These stay on the seabed for a prolonged period of time. We also can use specialized nets, which you can see right here in the central image. These are really good for gathering samples from the actual water itself above the seafloor. And then we also can use specialized sensors that can allow us to examine the physical properties of the water. So like the temperature, the salinity, other different types of nutrient presence, things like that. However, oftentimes, and in my experience especially, we primarily use a lot of more specialized equipment, especially to work with things actually on the seabed. And so the very first of these are the automated underwater vehicles. The one I have primarily worked with is Sentry, this little cute chiclet shaped device here. And these essentially act as underwater drones. They can be pre-programmed and then follow a set path, both following different depths and spaces along the seafloor as well. Now, these are completely outfitted with sensors in order to measure and monitor the various properties of the water that they're actually moving through. They can also be outfitted with different cameras. So Sentry has a specialized downward facing camera. So if it's moving above the seafloor, it can take pictures looking at the seabed so we can see what is there. And Sentry's special power is that it can actually produce exceptionally high resolution maps of the seafloor, which can be very beneficial, especially when we're trying to look at what factors might be influencing the biology of a species that we're working on. And the very strange goggle-like structures you see on it in these 2 images here are specially made devices that allow us to sample plankton or tiny microscopic animals that live in the water at very specific points and depths within the water column. And using Sentry like this actually allows us to get almost within a meter or so of the actual seabed. Well, if we were using a net, we would have to stay maybe like a couple hundred feet up off the seafloor to avoid entanglement hazards. So a very useful piece of equipment here. The other type are remotely operated vehicles. These are essentially very fancy robots that operate on the seafloor while remaining permanently tethered to the ship using what we call using a fiber optic umbilical that is threaded through this really specialized crane, which you can see here on the image on the right. And ROVs are very useful because they can remain working on the seafloor for upwards of days at a time. And that's primarily because through that umbilical, they're getting a constant stream of power. And these devices are also bristling with sensors and cameras. You can actually see some of those cameras and lights in that image on the right here on the upper brow portion of the machine. There also are 2 hydraulic manipulator arms that allow us to interact with the environment as well as equipment. And there's also a little basket at the front here that can be tucked away. And that basket can be completely customized and outfitted with different types of boxes to store samples, as well as various types of equipment as well. And these robots are operated from a control van, which you can see up here. It's that blue kind of cargo container box right up on the left-hand side of this image on the right. And inside that control van is a massive wall of high-resolution video monitors. And inside that control van, you have a team that's working together in watch shifts in order to keep the robot running and functioning. So each team has 3 engineers. You have the pilot who sits right in the center. You have a navigator who sits off to the side. They are essentially in control of making sure of trying to track where the robot is on the seafloor. And they're also the navigator is able to control the ship remotely from that chair. You also have a winch operator whose sole job is to control the crane and make sure that fiber optic umbilical cable doesn't have too much tension or too little tension, which apparently that's a very intense and stressful job, and I don't envy them. There's also 3 scientists on this team. So right next to the pilot, you have the lead, the science watch lead, and it's their job to make sure that all the science objectives are being met on the dive. You also have a recorder whose job is to kind of document all the discussions that are happening in the van. So if, let's say an objective can't be met for some reason, their job is to record down why and what might be going wrong. And then there is also a video logger whose entire job is to kind of find highlight reels in amongst the constant stream of video that's coming in from all these different cameras. So it's definitely a full-time job for everyone involved in this van. But the fun thing about working with a remotely operated vehicle is that because it's permanently connected to the ship, all the essentially what's happening on camera is live streamed throughout the ship. So for example, this picture of the monitor right here with all those weird little snails in it, that was actually taken from the galley. So you can be eating essentially a bowl of cereal and watching in real time what's happening on the seabed with the robot. So it's really fun. And then the third and probably most popular of these specialized equipments are the submersibles or the human-occupied vehicles. And as a quick note, submersibles are different than submarines because submersibles cannot generate their own power. However, they are completely untethered from the ship once they are deployed. So again, they're battery powered and they can remain on the seafloor for usually about a maximum of 8 hours. Generally, these are deployed right after breakfast and they're retrieved right before dinner time. However, they do have a lot of redundant backup systems. So if something were to go wrong, almost every component of the submersible can be isolated or dropped, and they can actually keep people alive on the seafloor for up to 4 days. They've never had to do that, but it's there just in case. And so this submersible that I have worked with primarily is Alvin. It is operated through the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and it's probably one of the more famous ones because it is the submersible that found the Titanic wreckage. The sphere, which you can see right here, is where up to 3 people can fit. It's not exactly the most glamorous or spacious ride. You can see in this image here in the center, you can see 3 people. You have 2 science observers on each dive, and here they're actually dressed in black. And the center figure in the image, dressed in white, is the pilot. And I actually feel bad for the pilots. They do not have a very comfortable seat. They spend the entire 8 hours essentially sitting on a glorified bicycle seat and leaning forward onto a special chest brace so they can look out through that front porthole. But Alvin is completely outfitted as well with sensors and cameras, so it can document everything that it's interacting with in the environment. It also has 2 manipulator arms up at the front, as well as another basket that can be customized, so you can do all the science objectives that you need to do. And usually when you are going down on a dive, they pack a lunch so you can have some snacks and a cup of coffee on the bottom of the ocean. But even if you aren't, I guess, chosen to do a research dive in the submersible, everyone on board has to go through specialized training regardless. So even if you don't get to be in the water in the submersible, you still get a chance to actually crawl into the submersible and sit in the sphere. And so you might also be wondering, now that we have all this equipment, what do you actually see when you're on the seabed, and what type of environments do you actually study? Or do you actually see when you're out there? And so, as you can imagine, there are many things I could have touched on with this. Sadly, we don't have the time in this one presentation. So I'll be talking about a couple of my few favorite places that are found specifically along the seabed. So I'm sorry if I don't touch on anything that you guys were really interested in or any of the fish that live up in the water column. However, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And at the end of this talk, I do have a slide with the various resources that you guys can also go and check on and do some other digging if you're interested as well. And so the very first habitat type that I wanted to talk about is very near and dear to my heart. And it is cold water corals, specifically cold water coral reefs and gardens. And so in case you weren't already aware, not all corals are found in the tropics. And in fact, more than half of all known coral species are found in deep water and actually thrive in areas past the reach of sunlight. And they can actually be found down to depths of almost 20,000 feet. And these are specifically known as cold water corals. Unlike their tropical counterparts, these do not have the algal symbionts that live in their tissues and make food. Instead, these coral species rely entirely on small food particles carried by the currents and falling from the ocean's surface. As you can imagine, they grow very slowly because it's not a lot of food. They're not getting access to a ton of food, and they are actually very long-lived. In fact, one species of black coral, which you can see pictured here on the left, it's called black coral because their skeleton is actually jet black like obsidian. One species was actually found to have an individual that was aged at 4,270 years old. And we were able to identify that because if you look at a cross-section through their base, right, where they attach to the rock, you can actually see little growth rings like the rings on a tree. As another interesting tidbit, a lot of these deep sea cold water corals have these vibrant colors, a lot of reds, oranges, pinks, yellows, purples. We don't know why they're so colored. They live in a place with no light and they are exceptionally colorful, and we currently don't know why. But what's really cool is that these coral colonies themselves are very big. So these 2 photos down here, you can see a couple women posing next to some of these collected colonies. They can be really huge. And what they do is they can actually add a lot of complex structure to the seabed, which usually can be pretty flat. And so by growing the way that they do, these corals form a lot of nooks and crannies that other animals can use as habitat. So a lot of times you can have a lot of fish, crabs, Shrimp and numerous other species are oftentimes found in abundance in association with these cold water corals, just like their tropical counterparts. And so when we have individual cold water corals, colonies that are found in dense groups, we actually call them coral gardens. We have this beautiful photo here on the lower right-hand side of the slide, where you can see an example of a coral garden. And some species, however, like this group called Lophilia on the upper portion of the slide. This is a type of hard reef-forming coral. And like their tropical counterparts, these cold water reef-forming corals can form large reef structures. And these can be fairly extensive. A recent study was actually published where they found one of these reef structures called the Million Mounds, which is found off Florida, the Carolinas, and Georgia, actually stretches for over 200 miles long and covers an area almost the size of Vermont. So these are incredible structures, and they, as you can imagine, lots of fish, lots of other life are found in association. Now, changing gears, we're going to head a little further out to sea here, and we're going to be discussing the abyssal plain. This is probably one of the more well-known areas of the deep sea, and it's probably exactly what you expect it to be. These are essentially very vast areas of mud. And the abyssal plains tend to lie at depths between 10 and 20,000 feet. And again, it's made of very, very fine particulate mud. And so being so far away from the continents and being so deep, as you can imagine, food input is very low. And so whatever life grows on the surface, like plankton and fish, when they die, they slowly sink through the water column. And a lot of that gets eaten on the way down. And so about less than 5% of all surface productivity actually makes it down to the seabed and the abyssal plain. And so at first glance, this can oftentimes resemble a desert. However, if you look carefully, you can actually start seeing a lot of tracks and footprints through the mud. And that's because there's actually a lot of animals here. It's actually a very diverse habitat in terms of the types of animals you can find. They're just really scattered because they're acting as scavengers, and they're kind of specialized for a life perpetually on the move, looking for that next meal. And so one example are sea cucumbers. And you can see this in the lower right-hand image here. They oftentimes move across the surface of the mud looking for small tidbits and morsels within the mud itself. And occasionally they can actually come together and form vast herds. We don't know how they're able to find each other across vast distances or why they herd like this, but they do. And the particular sea cucumbers seen here are known as sea pigs. So kind of cute. One of my personal favorites are tripod fish. You can see this here in the lower left. And these type of fish, they're only about a foot long, by the way. And they have these super modified fins that they kind of use to perch on up off the mud. And they are actually ambush predators. So they will sit there and wait for smaller fish or other crustaceans to swim by before they pounce and they're able to get their meal. And their very strange appearance and those long fins allow them essentially to sit motionless on the surface of the seabed. And essentially they can just wait there for months at a time, and they don't have to exert any energy. So it's very efficient, especially in such a food limited area like this. Then you also have giant isopods, which you can see here in the lower center of the slide. These are, I kind of think they're so ugly, they're kind of cute. They're actually related to the roly-polies or the pill bugs that you find in your garden, but these can grow to almost a foot long. And
Wow.
as another yeah, they're actually kind of big, but it's what's fun is a lot of submersible pilots view giant isopods as good luck, especially if they find one on their very first dive. And it's kind of like a weird rite of passage that when they're in control of the submersible for the first time, if they find a giant isopod, they have to take one of those hydraulic manipulator arms and kind of poke it in the butt. And the giant isopods can then tuck up their feet and kind of do like almost like a little lobster swim. And it's apparently a good luck and rite of passage for the pilots. So, however, an interesting thing about the abyssal plain is that parts are actually covered in potato-sized lumps of rock. These are known as polymetallic nodules. You might have heard them because they're actually, a lot of countries and companies are trying to mine these at the moment. If you ever heard of deep sea mining, this is what we're after. And it's because those interesting potato-sized lumps of rock have a lot of high concentrations of rare earth metals like lithium and cobalt and iron. And the interesting thing, though, is that last year, researchers found the very first evidence that because of that high metallic content, these rocks actually are producing a slight electric current that undergoes a process called hydrolysis, which splits the water molecules that surround them and essentially make oxygen, which is a big deal because this is the very first evidence we found that oxygen is being made on our planet that's not coming from algae or plants or photosynthesis. So this is kind of rocking the deep sea science community at the moment. And you might be hearing more about this if you haven't already, but it's really cool and it's really exciting. And we're trying to get more information to try and corroborate this finding, but still really cool. To change gears once again, you might also be wondering as to what happens when something big, like a whale, falls onto the seafloor. What happens to that carcass? And so once that whale or large tuna or log even, once that large organic item hits the seabed, it actually begins a very prolonged process that actually generates its own unique habitat and attracts its very unique forms of life. And so, for example, looking at whale falls, the very first thing that happens is, you're in this very food limited environment, and now you have this several ton carcass fall to the seabed. It kind of activates a feeding bonanza, and you have all these large scavengers, so sharks, large fish, and crabs kind of swarm in from afar to essentially consume all the soft tissue of that carcass. And that can take a couple months sometimes to actually consume the entire whale. And as that goes on, it's attracting a lot of other smaller scavengers until eventually what is left is you have the exposed bones of the whale. And if you're not aware, whale bones are actually completely filled with fats and lipids and a lot of energy and nutrients. And so what happens once those bones are exposed, you have a lot of specialized bacteria and what we call zombie worms that move in to help get at that marrow and the nutrients that are hidden in those bones. And so what you see here in the central image is a picture of those zombie worms, also known as osedacs, that are getting at the bone. And all those red filaments are kind of like the breathing tentacles of the worm. And this lower image on the right is actually the worm after it's removed from the bone. I know worm might be a very generous term for how it actually looks, but this large kind of lump of fluffy stuff at the bottom of the worm is essentially its gonad, that's its reproductive bits. It hides them in the bone because it's nice and protected and nothing can really get at those eggs or that the gonadal material. And in that little lump of fluff, there is also a lot of bacteria that are helping the zombie worm break down the nutrients inside the bone. So again, they're really weird looking, but zombie worms are only found on whale falls and in the bones of large animals that have fallen to the seafloor. So they are incredibly specialized just to this one type of environment. And as the bacteria and these zombie worms break down those fats and those lipids inside the bones, they produce a kind of side compound called sulfides, which a lot of other animals then use as food. So as the bones continue to break down, you will see a lot of mussels, tube worms, and clams can also move in. And this portion of the breakdown of the whale carcass can actually last for over 100 years. So the single whale can provide food for sometimes millions of animals for over a century at a time. And after all the nutrients have been extracted from those bones, the current theory is that, those nice hard bits sitting on the middle of the mud can actually act as a nice anchor point for a lot of other animals to kind of live and kind of get themselves up off the seabed a little bit. So things like corals and anemones, things that like to have a nice strong anchor point that isn't going to get moved around on them. They can actually come in and use these bones. And I'm next going to focus on probably one of the more popular deep sea topics, and these are the hydrothermal vents, which I recall someone mentioned earlier. And so these are found in areas of volcanic activity, whereas there is the potentiality of seawater seeping into the Earth's crust through cracks. And then there it becomes superheated by magma. And so that water can actually reach upwards of 752 degrees Fahrenheit. It's been the hottest on record at the moment. And then due to some really fancy chemistry and physics, it dissolves heavy metals from the Earth's crust and then carries those metals along with it as it rises back up to the seabed. And once that superheated water hits the surrounding sea water, which at the bottom of the ocean is just above freezing, all of those heavy metals precipitate out in this black cloud that comes out of those chimneys. And over time, all those particles build these really complex structures, which are the chimneys that we all know and love. And all the chemicals coming out of this superheated water actually allows bacteria to thrive in really huge numbers. And this bacteria feeds off the chemicals using a process called chemosynthesis. So think of plants and sunlight and making energy. It's the same process, but replace the plants with bacteria and the sunlight with nasty chemicals. And you can actually see evidence of this in this photo of the chimney right here. All that white stuff in the background are actually mats of bacteria that are feeding off those chemicals. And hydrothermal vents were actually only discovered in 1977, so they're actually fairly recent. And it was these discoveries that actually allowed us to realize that not all life on Earth depended on products derived from the sun. So this finding in 1977 revolutionized a lot of how we approach biology. And those bacteria that are present in these areas actually are able to support a large group of animals, such as famously the giant tube worms, which you can see here in this image with those big red plumes. These tube worms can reach to up to 10 feet tall. You can also have specialized shrimp, which you can see in this upper image here. These shrimp have a specialized third eye in the middle of their head that are designed to see heat. And then you also have what are called Pompeii worms. These shrimp and Pompeii worms feed on this bacteria that live right at the edge of that superheated water. Each vent system, though, as you can imagine, is actually very unique because it's being fueled based on that specific geology that underlies it. And so no two vent fields are the same, and definitely no two hydrothermal vent chimneys are the same. So again, the chemistry can change based on where you are. So some hydrothermal vent areas we have what we call black smokers. These are where the fluids are filled with iron sulfides, which give it that classic black appearance. However, other vent fields that we have found recently are actually spewing out things like talc and calcium and silicon, which can actually make that black smoke actually look white. And again, some of these chimneys have been venting for very long periods of time. So the current record holders are actually at a vent field called Lost City, which is on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And these chimneys are the tallest on record. This image here on the left is a composite photo, so it's many different images that have been stitched together. And these chimneys are over 200 feet tall. They're as tall as a skyscraper, just sitting on the bottom of the seabed, venting hot fluid. I find them really pretty. And then the last thing I wanted to discuss in terms of the deep sea environments are cold seeps. These are actually what I worked on for a lot of my dissertation, so they're also very near and dear to my heart. And these are so-called cold seeps because unlike hydrothermal vents, which are nice and superheated, these are actually at the ambient seawater temperature at the seabed. So just above freezing, or around 4 degrees centigrade or 35 degrees Fahrenheit. These were actually only discovered in 1983, so even more recent than hydrothermal vents. And these are actually found all over the edges of the continents, all over the world, anywhere where you can have organics that are getting buried under a lot of sediment. So think of like areas offshore of major rivers like the Mississippi. It's actually one reason why the Gulf of Mexico is seen as so oily, is because it has a lot of organics that are getting buried by the sediment that's being deposited by the Mississippi River. And so what happens is, due to various processes, that oil and natural gas that's being buried under all that sediment can find its way up through fissures to the seabed and is then released into the water column. So these videos here, you can actually see gas bubbles coming out of the seabed, and this is actually pure methane gas coming out of the seafloor. And it is a completely natural process. It's actually very healthy. And the presence of these chemicals can actually fuel dense communities of bacteria where, similar to hydrothermal vents, those bacteria can take that chemical energy and convert it into food through chemosynthesis. And so again, like at hydrothermal vents, these cold seep communities can support huge amounts of animals. So seeps are oftentimes dominated either by large tube worms that can be up to 6 feet tall and can form these huge bushes that are like the size of like a passenger van, or mussels. And some of these mussels can be very big. This is actually a picture of my lab mate here on the lower right-hand portion of the screen, holding one of these mussels that is the size of her forearm. And these mussels can form huge, extensive, and very dense beds, which you can see here in this lower video. And these beds can actually cover tens of and sometimes up to 100 acres on the seafloor. And as you can imagine, similar to cold water corals, the presence of these mussels and these large tube worms adds a lot of complex structure to the seabed, which is otherwise, flat mud. And so these structures and the presence of all this energy and bacteria and food essentially attracts a lot of other animals to come in and form these really large, complex communities. So in the mussel beds, in this one image here, you can actually, all those white dots are snails. If you look carefully, you can also see sea anemones. You can find sea cucumbers and fish and other different types of sharks that are moving around the area. And all these other animals use the cold seeps as places for food, shelter, and even like nurseries so they can rear their young. And kind of surprisingly, you can find some really large predators that maybe you don't necessarily associate with the seafloor. For example, on one of our dives, we actually spotted this, which we did not expect to see almost 2,000 feet down. It was a 5-foot swordfish swimming around. And if you look carefully, you'll see this particular swordfish actually has something in its mouth. And that's actually a lump of cold water coral that it had broken off. And apparently it really did not like the presence of the submersible because it threw it at the submersible, which I didn't realize fish could throw things, but they can. So unfortunately, I realize I'm starting to run out of time for our talk here. And I realize I haven't really had the chance to touch on a lot of different things in the deep sea. So if you do want to dig into more of these topics and hear a little bit more, or just get lost watching a lot of really cool footage from the deep ocean, I have a couple resources on this slide that you guys can check out. Deep Sea News, you'll recognize it because it has that really distinctive logo of the giant squid with the eye patch. It has a lot of really interesting stories and is written by a lot of deep sea researchers themselves, as well as science communicators. The DOSI, or Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, also is a really good place to keep tabs on different types of policy, management, as well as a lot of research that's coming out in real time. They can also flag when things are open access and are not hidden by paywalls, which is really exciting. MBARI, or the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, is an amazing non-for-profit, if you haven't come across it yet, that has a very extensive video and image library that you guys can flip through. Also, if you guys happen to ever find yourselves out in California near Monterey Bay, the Monterey Bay Aquarium currently has a deep sea touch tank where you can actually go and like hold and touch things like giant deep sea isopods, if you're curious and are into that type of thing. And then NOAA has an amazing Ocean Explorer website, as well as the NOAA Okeanos Explorer, which has a YouTube channel where you can just kind of dig through their video and image library. And the Okeanos, whenever it is out at sea, also live streams their dives on YouTube, so you can kind of watch and see what's happening in real time on the seabed. But with that, I am going to wrap up, and I would like to thank Herring Gut for organizing this wonderful event. And if you guys have any questions, I am happy to answer them now.
Oceanographer said to me once that the ocean and the life in it supports all life. It sustains all life, and without it, we wouldn't be here. Do you agree with that?
I do, actually. If you think about just the sheer amount of water that exists in the oceans, a lot of rain first starts, like, forms over the ocean. And so a lot of the big like storm systems, I know Maine has gotten kind of like a conveyor belt of snowstorms this past winter. If you actually trace a lot of those storms originated over the Pacific Ocean. So you guys are actually getting some good influence from the Pacific Ocean, for example. And relating back to the deep sea holds a lot of nutrients, and a lot of those nutrients get upwelled or get through special types of currents get brought back up to the surface, for example, off the coast of the Pacific Northwest. And that reintroduction of nutrients fuels a lot of fisheries and supports a lot of different animals like salmon that we also like to eat. And again, with the discovery of deep oxygen and all these other things, in a lot of ways, it all stems back to the ocean. And just based on the sheer amount of surface area that the ocean covers, a lot of the algae or phytoplankton in the surface waters of the ocean are actually what make most of the oxygen that we breathe. Trees obviously are huge and very important, but most of it actually comes from algae in the ocean. It's a great question, though.
Not blue up, okay, I would make her bigger though,
You
so.
can also turn on your bioluminescent glow sticks if you'd like.
Everyone has
Hey,
a glow stick.
Yes.
We had a question from the chat.
Yeah.
Wanted to ask about the risk of animals interacting with the submersible or ROV cables.
Ooh, that's a really good question. So ROV cables, yeah. So ROV cables are maybe like that big. You know, they're nice and like actually decently thick, but in the grand scheme of the ocean, it's kind of like a needle in the haystack. They're kind of small in the grand scheme of things. And a lot of fish and animals, especially as you head further down, are very sensitive to vibrations and movement in the water around them. So as the ROV is moving on the seabed, and as that cable is kind of getting pulled with the action of the ship being bounced by the waves, that cable is perpetually making vibrations and movement. So a lot of fish and other swimming animals can oftentimes sense the presence of that cable and can avoid it. A lot of the more, I guess, more gelatinous things like jellyfish, they might bump into it, but I can't see like just bumping into a cable being the most damaging. In terms of the submersible, now that is a really interesting question because the submersible, like the Alvin is actually shockingly big. It actually kind of took me aback when I first saw it. And so the pilots, when they're driving around the submersible, if they aren't careful, yeah, they can accidentally whack something because, you know, their field of view is only so big. But a lot of these pilots spend years training before they're actually really allowed to pilot the submersible on their own. And usually they go through many, many rounds of training dives. And on that, they have a professional pilot right there kind of helping them through it so they can learn the dimensions of the sub. So when they are driving it around these environments, they're as careful as they physically can. But I can imagine at times there might be some things might get bumped. But they do the best that they can to minimize that damage. And a lot of the robots like Jason and Alvin itself, they also have specialized systems that can kind of help them hover in place. So what they will try to do is kind of come down at a slight angle so that basket is maybe touching the seabed and they can see where that basket is hitting, but the back end of the robot or the sub might be up a little bit. And then that specialized system can help them hover and hold in place against the action of currents. So they can kind of minimize their footprint, essentially, of what they're hitting on the seabed, if that answers your question.
Thanks for bringing up the currents too. A lot of people don't think about the speed of the water for the ocean floor and the fact that it's moving. It's not solid stationary.
It is. And if you guys think back to when I was first talking about cold seeps, there's that video on the bottom right. I might be able to flip back through it if you guys are interested, but you can actually see the current ripping along the bottom in that video. And it actually is a huge consideration when we are working on the seabed, just because, yeah, there are places where the current is absolutely ripping along. And if the submersible or our robot pilot isn't careful, it can actually cause everything to drift and move, which can be really difficult if you're trying to do some really fine work on the seabed and you're getting casually pushed around by the current, which essentially is a strong wind with a lot more mass behind it. But also if you're working with things like moorings or landers that you're just deploying from the side of the ship, you have to take that strong current into consideration because it can drastically change where your equipment actually hits the seabed. And if you're trying to get it to hit a specific spot, if you're not careful, that mooring or lander can maybe sometimes wind up over a mile away from where you actually want it to be.
We have another question in the chat. This one's from my mom. How is the deep sea impacted by climate change?
Oh, we are still trying to deduce that. But unfortunately, we are seeing impacts. For example, cold water corals. There is this is where it gets down to some of the fun deep ocean chemistry. There is a point in the ocean where things like calcium dissolve because seawater, especially at depth, tends to be a little bit more acidic than it does up on the sea surface. And that's natural. It's just because as you head further down in the water, you have less, up till recently, you have less oxygen production because there's no photosynthesis. And so usually, but you still have animals respiring, exhaling, and they still produce a lot of CO2, and CO2 can allow the water to be acidic. So deep bottom water in the ocean tends to be naturally more acidic than the surface. And so as you head down, there's a point called the aragonite or calcium saturation zone. And below that, water is acidic enough that it is more difficult to make things like shells. And we are seeing evidence that corals and animals like snails, for example, that had been able to keep pace with that, are suddenly they are starting to experience some stress because the deep sea is becoming more acidic than it also used to be. And climate, and moving away from climate change as well. I mean, obviously the deep sea hasn't started heating up yet, but there are places where maybe not like the abyssal plain, but other deep areas in the world, for example, like the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming bodies of water on the planet. And that is impacting some of the deep sea floor within the Gulf of Maine. And so I remember a couple years ago, back when I was working as a lab technician, back at the University of Maine, I think there was an article headline that came out about how the sea floor in the Gulf of Maine was actually experiencing a bit of a heat wave. And one of the hot topics in the lab I've been in is how is that impacting the cold water corals? Because a lot of these animals are so used to that very stable, just above freezing temperature, any fluctuation in temperature can cause them distress just because they're not used to that. But there's a lot of other impacts that are hitting the deep sea. There's a lot of trash and microplastics that have been found, even at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Again, deep sea mining is a really hot topic in deep water work right now, just because we don't know how it's really going to impact a lot of the animals and communities found in those areas. Yeah. Again, big question, really good question though.
We might have time for one more quick question. If anybody in the classroom or on the Zoom chat has anything to ask?
Are there any international rules about who owns or who can use the deep water zones?
Yes, this is also currently a really hot button topic and a huge point of discussion right now. So every nation has what we call an exclusive economic zone, or an EEZ, that extends out from the continent, from the shoreline about 200 miles. Beyond that, you get into what is known as the high seas. It's the ultimate no man's land, and it's most of the ocean. It's beyond national jurisdiction. No country owns it. And I believe there are a lot of really big treaties and precedent that say no one owns it. And it's an interesting topic because a lot of the areas that we want that are set for mining lie in the high seas, so beyond areas of national jurisdiction. And so, for example, if you ever look up the Clarion-Clipperton zone, it's actually a huge area that almost rivals the size of the continental US that's out in the Pacific. And it's where a lot of the mining activities are currently being focused on, because there's a lot of those potato-sized nodules that I mentioned earlier. And so there is an International Seabed Authority, or the ISA, that has formed to try and figure out how to manage things that are technically owned by no one. And so they're currently working up treaties and contracts to try and deal with that exact question. So the short answer is we're trying to figure that out because no one knows, and we haven't had to try and answer that question up till now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lauren Rice.
And thank you all for those wonderful questions and coming out tonight, and again for Hair & Gut for organizing this opportunity. Thank you.
And there's food in the back, please take food so I don't have to bring it home.
Rotate it around so she can see the audience and
Oh,
I'll
yes.
turn on the light.
A full house tonight.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey.
Hopefully you'll come back to me.
Soon as I can. I miss the snow.